personal growth, interpersonal relationships.
We're alive. You're alive, Summer. She's alive.
Yeah, luckily. Been a hell of a week in Texas.
Oh, Summer, how are you feeling? Are you clean? Are you washed? Are you stinky?
I am no longer stinky, thank baby Jesus. I was without power for the first half of the week and then without water the second half of the week. Not even bad compared to a lot of folks. I froze, but they didn't burst. So that's
okay. We're gonna have to talk about this trauma because that's what today's episode is about. So welcome, everyone. You're listening to Your Radical Being. My name is Fiona Rene.
And Samar Poorlakani.
And we are discussing our said radical beings to inspire and connect with your radical beings. We're talking about trauma today. We're talking about past trauma, current trauma, future trauma. So let's start off with the trauma that Summer is literally knee deep in right now.
It's like Hurricane Harvey level type of damage, except not just to the coast, but the whole state. It's pretty bad. And I think as a helper myself, trying to make sure that I have enough spoons to be fully present with my clients, being in the thick of it all with them right now, end up putting my stuff on hold and then giving myself allotted time slots in my schedule, which is this is the time that you can break down, which, is helpful for me being the type A person I am. I'm of course I would schedule my meltdowns. It's so typical. In all of that, it's I almost forget that I've gone through something really traumatic. And so it hits me even harder. And so I didn't think about it until at one point yesterday when I went and saw my new doctor, saw a new rheumatologist and got a new diagnosis. So that's a whole other story. In that appointment, she asked me how I was doing and told me a little bit about her housing situation. And then I thought about it as I was telling her out loud that I had to monitor my body temperature because I was borderline 95 degrees. And at that point, you have to go seek medical attention for hypothermia. That's scary. Having to process that I was doing jumping jacks one evening just to make sure that my body temperature rose, that's terrifying. And how that impacted my body over the week after that as well, the amount of pain that I had.
Yeah, that's the funny thing about trauma is that you go through the traumatic event and that in itself is traumatizing, but then your own mental and emotional awareness and observation of said event may not even happen until after the fact. That's almost even more traumatizing than the traumatic event itself. Double trauma. Obviously, it's necessary in order to go through and grow through it, right? But I guess I wonder when we become victims, when we have to make sure that we remove ourselves from the victim mindset so that we're not drowning in that trauma all the time.
And I think a lot of it's even just acknowledging it as a trauma, right? How many experiences do we not only have other people dismiss or discount, invalidate, but we do it to ourselves. So recognizing that this was a pretty traumatic experience and then but it's not as traumatic as other people, maybe survivor's guilt making me gaslight myself. It's going to be a process. Trauma is complex and things like EMDR are so helpful, but
explain to our listeners what EMDR is.
An eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. You were correct. It's a psychotherapy treatment that helps with trauma. For people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, it's such a complicated thing. You said it's so complex, but it seems like first step is to acknowledge the trauma, accept the trauma, and not gaslight yourself or convince yourself that it's not something traumatic.
Yeah. And that's hard, right? Even if you go through the process of acknowledging it yourself and validating your own experience and what you're going through, then it's how many other people don't know how to handle the discomfort of that conversation, discussing trauma and being but you're fine. Everything's okay. You have power now, that kind of toxic positivity. And it's because the other person's uncomfortable in that space. that we like want to fix it.
And then what's the next step? What about the place where, okay, I accept that I went through something traumatic. I grew through it. I became stronger. And now I've handled that. What keeps me from reliving it and or, obviously I don't want to just forget about it. I don't want to just forget that I went through it. But simultaneously, I don't want to victimize myself and say, oh, poor me, I had to go through this all the time. Where's the line?
Well, even if you don't want to be in it mentally, emotionally, spiritually, like be in that all the time, like your body can still keep that score. There's a book about trauma called The Body Keeps Score. So that's why it's just so complicated. And I think that people not knowing how to handle it, or people not knowing how to grow from it, or people not knowing how to cope, like that itself is so complex. I don't know if anyone goes through like a traumatic experience like a hurricane and is like, now I'm ready for any hurricane going forward because I survived this one, but like that's like no one should look at it like that. That idea of resiliency is not a human experience we all need to have.
And I wonder, from my own personal experience, I feel like I had a very traumatic childhood. Whether that was emotional abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, right? All of those kinds of traumatic experiences that I went through throughout my childhood. Now it's like I almost claim my badge of honor because of it. You can't fuck with me because I've already been fucked with, right? But then that mindset almost made me jaded. It was almost like, if you haven't been through trauma, then I can't even respect you.
Ooh, okay.
If you haven't been through what I've been through, you'll never know.
And your dad's voice when you say that. Like, yeah.
Well, and that's what it is. A lot of my trauma came from my parents and their abuse to me, whether they even realized that they were abusing me at the time. Because
a lot of people don't, right?
Well, of course, because in their day, that wasn't abuse. When my dad was a kid, he got his ass whooped 3 days a week with a leather belt and had to do physical labor as a punishment. And that in his community was accepted to be normal and natural. So him projecting his own trauma onto me is almost where I get my trauma from. It's like, he may be the abuser, but it's almost like he's the victim too. So it's a weird
generational trauma.
Yeah, dripping down. Where do we nip it in the bud?
And some of it, like, you can't help, right? Like, they're people of Jewish faith, or, there were obviously more than just Jewish people who were impacted by the Holocaust, but like that generational trauma, right? Like,
oh my God.
So it's a lot.
There's just so many kinds of trauma, and there's so much weird judgment in regards to, oh, I've been through more than you have.
Yeah.
And that I've got more notches on my belt. So therefore, what does that mean?
It comes with age, right? Like that comparison is often like between people and big age differences too.
Yeah, we get jaded. I'm 33 and he's 22, so he doesn't know better. He hasn't been through what I've been through. Yeah. And there's a really disgusting, jaded kind of mindset there that doesn't make me feel like my heart is open. It doesn't make me feel like I'm willing to learn. It makes me feel like I'm trying to pull some better than you card because I've been through more pain, and it doesn't feel right.
Yeah, having gone through that pain doesn't make you like a better person in just having to experience it. I don't know. I see this a lot between boomers and millennials, right? Like, I had to do this and you do too, even things like student loans can be argued that way. Well, I paid my loans. Why can't you pay yours? I
think that's the key point right there from this conversation so far, is that there are so many experiences that we have, and no one can really understand the traumatizing elements of them except the person who actually experienced them themselves. Yeah. So there can't be a compare and contrast chart. And I have a lot of friends, one in particular, who, because he has gone through so much trauma, he wants recognition from getting out of it. He wants some kind of recognition in regards to, I've been through this, and I'm not there anymore, so who's going to give me my goddamn trophy?
And a gold star.
Yeah, and I feel that. I'm like, I want a freaking cookie and a gold star for not being a drug addict anymore and not abusing other people the way I was abused. That growth I'm so proud of. But then it's almost like that pride becomes its own trauma.
It becomes
like
a stunt in the growth.
yeah, it stunts my growth, the hubris, and it almost creates something just as, I don't know, traumatizing for other people.
Yeah.
Right? Making them feel less than, making them feel like they owe me something, which can't be good.
Invalidating them in some way, maybe. Like, yeah, no one wants to experience that.
Yeah. A lot of my childhood trauma that was inflicted upon me without my control or choice happened a bit before you and I met. You know, it was like 9, 10, 11, those years where I had no control. I could not protect myself. And it hardened me so much that by the time you and I met, I was...
The first time? Like when we were 13 and 14, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I was
hard. Yeah.
I was hardened. I was stone cold.
You're scary.
I was scary. Sorry.
It was intense. I was like, why is this like 13, 14-year-old acting as if she's like 18?
She's 18 and she's got a gun in her pocket and a vendetta. Yeah. I mean, that's what trauma did to me, I think.
Yeah.
Is one, it gave me that jaded mindset that these kids, these 11 to 13-year-olds that are my age, they don't know what life is.
Yeah, I've seen some real shit at 13. Yeah.
And so I think that's almost why I dipped into sex and drugs and this concept of being almost cool or disassociated, because that was like the only way for me to express myself past my trauma.
Yeah. It was like a way you had control as well, right? Like, you know, this is obviously all stuff that your parents weren't going to be like willy-nilly about if they knew, but
yeah, I'm in control now. You think you can traumatize me? Pfft, take this. I'm going to traumatize you back.
Yeah,
right?
Drugs and rock and roll.
I noticed that becomes a cycle, because then the way I respond to my old trauma creates new trauma. And then that trauma becomes my old trauma that I now need to react to and express. And it's just literally a continuous spiral of trauma begetting new trauma, begetting new trauma. So where do we nip it in the bud? And how does our mindset with how we heal come into play?
Well, you know, bringing up drugs and addiction, it made me think of like when we have trauma upon trauma upon trauma, where shame is in there, like just woven in. And then, you know, when we look at addiction, it's like a chicken and egg cycle with shame, right? Like, are we ashamed, therefore we're drinking? Or are we drinking because we're ashamed? Like we get stuck in that cycle. I was specifically reading about Black women and resiliency. And the thing that I read was like, there's no resilience without trauma. And like, yeah. So.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. Because that's true. It's just like what we were talking about before. There is no courage without fear. There is no true resilience without trauma.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. And I think that as long as we don't get stuck and stagnant in that trauma and we learn how to move forward and be courageous and brave enough to let ourselves experience new trauma, I think that's what it is for me, is that for the longest time, I relied so heavily on showing off what I had been through that I was actually hiding behind that instead of experiencing something new.
Yeah.
I can see that with like dating, you know, becoming vulnerable. It's scary, you know, because you think, okay, last time I was vulnerable, it was very traumatic. So I don't want to do that again because I'm going to experience that trauma again. That was hard. I had to become so resilient.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing. Like, I mean, I think that's what life is, right? Like, it's not like you have like, we're playing tic-tac-toe with trauma or something. We got 3 in a row and we're like done for life. You know, like, you know, no more problems, no more trauma, no more, you know, like work to be done. It's like, yeah, like it's cheesy, but the idea of like, I never lose, I either win or learn. Like, I really look at it that way. It's like, once you get your heart broken enough times that you're like, oh, this is just going to be a thing. Like, maybe it's like the cynical me, but maybe it's a realistic me that like, I think whenever I was younger, especially when I was monogamous and married, it felt like when a relationship ended, it was a failure, right? Like I did something wrong and I failed in some way. And, you know, that was something to be like ashamed of. And now it's like, I feel really lucky to have had the relationships I've had. I feel like it's very lucky that I can say that I've loved like 4 people, that I still love 4 people you know, in my romantic life. And so like, and all of those relationships are over. So like, is that for failures, or is that for like experiences that were worthy in multiple ways? And so it comes back to that happiness quote that I really like, which is happiness is not the absence of problems. It's your ability to deal with them. So with every trauma, when I've learned something from it and I know how to like move through it more or be vulnerable in different ways, like that just makes me more prepared for the next one, because you know it's coming.
Yeah. It's all what I'm learning right now from you is kind of like I was in a relationship where I was gaslit and emotionally and mentally abused by this partner in my 20s. This is all hypothetical. And and it was very right. I was actually probably the abuser. It was very traumatic, right? Let's say that. And now I'm in a relationship, and that person is starting this new relationship where a person is starting to do that to me again. Well, because of what I've learned, I can either be triggered by that trauma, freak out, have some PTSD response, which could include shutting down, losing control, right? And all of these are valid responses. Or I can view that trauma, learn from that trauma, and I can go, oh, hey, wait a minute. I could respond to this similarly to how I did when I went through it before. I could be scared of this because it hurt me in the past, or I could see my own resilience, realize I've been through something similar, and I can choose a new way to respond.
It could be both or neither, you know, like it's when you think about trauma responses in the brain, like the fight, flight, freeze, or now they're saying the fourth F is fawn, which is like the people pleasing. You don't always have control, right? Like it came down to a lot of the Me Too stuff we talked about in, I don't know, episode 4 or something.
Yeah.
Or, you know, it's like, even though I know better, or I'm confident, or I've been through this already, like you cannot predict when you're going to freeze. You're not going to predict when you're going to fight or fly. So I think, you know, it could be both. It could be being triggered, but then also still like growing from it. You know, the movement doesn't even have to be forward. I kind of just like the idea of movement. Like we talk about this in therapy, which is like, you maybe took 2 steps forward and then 3 steps back, but like at least you're moving.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's the key, right? Is like when we become stagnant, that's when we maybe will have a problem. But what we were talking about at the very beginning of this episode, it's kind of like that. It's the events that I experience are actually less traumatic than my own observance of how I respond to said events. So if I go into an audition and the audition was extremely intense, the people who were sitting behind the table scoffed at me and judged me, asked me a question in a rude way, told me that they didn't like me, right? I leave that audition. I don't usually think about all the things they did to me. I think about how I responded to them. And I'm almost traumatizing myself in my own mind by going, oh, well, you could have done that and you could have done this. And why did you do that? Why did you do it this way? I wonder for
is that where the negative self-talk comes in?
Yeah, but more so like the long-term traumatizing event for me that is the most memorable isn't necessarily that audition, but me sitting in my car crying and hyperventilating by myself after the audition.
Yeah. For some folks, even hearing that kind of like criticism could trigger old traumas that are like, remember when your parents said that to you all the time, you know? So it's interesting that that's where you went with your response, because my first one would have been every single like A- I got in school and like the scolding I got for that, you know, brown kid problems. But the thing with triggers is you can't predict them. That's why they're triggering.
Yeah. And it just makes me feel so bad. There's so many times where I have judged someone else, looked down upon someone else because I had some opinion that they shouldn't be triggered by something. Or they shouldn't feel traumatized by something. And it's impossible to know what is traumatic for one person versus somebody else. It's literally impossible.
It's interesting when you talk about like judging others, because I feel like so much of it is like your own projection of yourself, right? And like, what does like that look like for you? Like when you feel like you've done enough, or you've done the work, or you've moved on. I remember having a moment. I was having 6, as you do, and
yum, 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 yum.
I looked over, this guy had a mirror on one side, like one whole side of the room. And I like looked over and saw myself in the mirror. And the thing that we were doing took me back to an experience with my high school boyfriend who, you know, that in itself is pretty traumatizing, right? Like that whole experience. But it reminded me of this one very specific day in that same sense where I like looked over in the mirror and I was like, what are you doing? And this is like 10 plus years after. This is like years of therapy after. So then I'm like triggered and then feeling really exposed and vulnerable and then confused because I was like, I haven't been triggered like that in so long.
I thought I was healed.
Exactly. Where it's like, oh shit, wow, it's not linear. Okay. But like, you know, even knowing that as a therapist, because I was already, I think, practicing at that point. Well, the point is like the quote unquote, I knew better, or I thought I knew myself. Then I like had shame on top of it. So I'm like not only just juggling like someone else's response to what they just witnessed me go through with them, right? Like the other person that I was on top of, but like, you know, then having to go through so many different narratives on my own of like, it's all right, but I thought it was okay, but like, and it's just, you know, crash and burn.
Yeah.
Empathy is the answer to all things.
Yeah. You're so right. Empathy is the answer to all things. Every time I have an experience where I flash back to some traumatic event from my childhood, immediately that jaded, you'd have not been through what I've been through. And
The punk rock Fiona.
Yeah, punk rock Fiona that you better respect because you don't understand what I've seen. That always comes up. I'm always fighting it.
You fight that a lot. I feel like there was a period in your life, you know, a couple of years ago, but like anytime you were hooking up with someone new, that voice came back where it was like, is this like an addiction thing? Is this like teenage me thing? Is it okay to have like this sexual experience with this new person? Is there some guideline that I need to be following? Like, was it okay that it was right away, or was it better to wait a couple dates? You know, like I feel like there was a time frame where we had to talk through things that like could be totally normal for anyone else, but because of your history and your experience, you questioned yourself a lot.
Well, a lot of the time it's because, you know, you do something that you want to say to yourself, I wouldn't do that again.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, I slept with like 20 people without a condom and I didn't tell them that I had herpes. God, I would never do that again. So then once you have one experience that's anywhere slightly similar to any of those, it's like, wait, am I doing that again? Or is this okay? Or is that new? Or is that, it's such a bizarre thing. Cause like you said, it's not linear. It's all a weird tangled web.
And how easy it is to fall down one of those rabbit holes, right? Where like that was really similar, therefore I'm a shitty person, I still haven't grown, I'm so shitty, you know, like right. Playing game.
And that experience now becomes a new adult trauma that may or may not be connected to my childhood trauma that I thought I healed, right? And it becomes its own new grown-up trauma,
like putting a Band-Aid on top of your Band-Aid. When you have through it, it's like that shit's, you're not containing that any better. You're just like, now it's just thick. Not thick in a way that we like, the THICC.
I'm glad we can talk about this because what I find to be the most healing is just being able to unshamefully discuss it. Right? I can call you and say, I feel like I had a traumatizing thing happen to me today. And you don't say, oh, that wasn't so bad. But you also don't say, God, I bet you're not okay. You kind of let me diagnose myself and digest myself if you have enough spoons to hold that space with me. And I wonder how that affects how we treat other people nowadays. And this is what we'll get into in the next episode whenever we talk about, projecting onto others all of the isms that we live by, maybe not even on purpose, right? Because of our trauma.
Yeah. Oh, that was a good segue. I like that. From like past trauma to current trauma, how society, conditioning, systemic shit that we are just completely in. Like, there's just so much work.
It's not just our parents' trauma that we're having to clean out of ourselves, but it's the world's trauma, right? It's our society, our community, our state.
Global, yeah.
Because our world and our society has gone through so much of its own trauma. We're digesting that as individuals, and it becomes a mass issue as opposed to an individual issue.
Yeah. I mean, even months ago, we were talking about how, I think, and maybe I heard this in one of the presidential debates, about how we're going through like 4 pretty significant historic moments in time, right? Like we're going through like an economic crisis. We have a racial identity crisis, Black Lives Matter, like racism, being anti-racist, like that whole thing. I mean, it's
pandemic.
Right. The pandemic being number 3, and then number 4 being the existential, like long-term, the climate change issue. Right. Yeah. And there's like just 4 things that was talked about not even 6 months ago. So it's like, it just keeps piling on as we've gone into this new year.
We're still digesting trauma from our grandparents during the Great Depression and the crises that they went through, and war that our parents have gone through, and their trauma and their racial crises. So the fact that we're now as a society going through new crises of our own, how not only do we digest old traumas that are societal, but not let them affect and impose onto these new ones, and it's almost impossible. So let's talk about that next episode. It will be our season finale of season 1 of Your Radical Being. We'll get deep
for our last finale.
We're gonna talk real shit, real time. Thank you guys so much for joining us. You have been listening to Your Radical Being. Make sure to check us out on Instagram at your.radical.being, and we will be talking to you very soon. This is Fiona Rene
and Samar Poorlakani,
and we're signing off. Woo woo woo!
Doodle. Bye.